Hi, and welcome to another edition of Virtual Vitamin Z, where we bring the zoo to you. I'm Erin, and I'm the Nature Center's manager, and today we're going to showcase celebrating and saving wildlife here in the backyard of the BelleIsle Nature Center. So we are going to focus on life under a log, and this is going to be a two-part video, and so you'll see the first part today, and then next week you can join us for the second part. Because there's a lot to learn about these organisms that live under a log, and hopefully by the end, even though they kind of have a bad rap sometimes, you'll have developed some appreciation for all of the creepy crawly critters that live under a log. And if you don't have a log in your backyard, that is totally fine. What we really need is a micro habitat, so a tiny habitat for tiny organisms. And it could be a flower pot or lawn furniture or a small log or a big piece of bark, something that is going to allow organisms to have moved under there and make it a home or a habitat, and something that hasn't moved in a long time so that it's given them time to settle there. So before we begin, let's go over our vocabulary, our skills, and the materials that we'll need for our activities. All right, so the vocabulary today, we'll start with decomposer. And a decomposer is an organism that eats things that are dead or decaying. That might be plant material like the leaves in our yards in the fall, or it could be other organisms that have passed away. They play a really important role even in our microhabitats that we're talking about today, because without them, all of that material would build up. Okay, we're also going to learn the word vertebrate. And vertebrate means backbone or something having a spine. And so I want you to reach your hand around if you can and find those knobs on the back of your neck that make up your backbone. And so the vertebrates are humans, and then things like mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians. And so if we look at the next word, invertebrate, that is something that does not have this skeleton. And so think of things like insects or mollusks or clams and things like that. So those do not have an internal skeleton. So the last important word today is exoskeleton. And if you remember, we have an internal skeleton. It's inside of us, and our muscles and blood and all of our bodies are built around that structure. Well, animals that are invertebrates, some of them have an exoskeleton, and exo means outside. So they have sort of a harder shell or protective covering that functions as a skeleton would to give them some structure and some protection. We are going to look at some organisms that are invertebrates, so they do not have that internal bone structure, but also that do not have an exoskeleton, so they don't have much to protect them from either predators or sunshine and weather conditions. Skills that we're going to work on today are observation, comparing and contrasting, classification, and we're even going to do a little bit of graphing. So the only materials you need today are a pencil and paper. And if you just have something like a marker or a crayon, that will work too. All right, a couple words of caution for both us and the animals we're going to be observing. Before we roll a log or move a piece of lawn furniture, we want to take a minute to observe it. I want to make sure that there are not stinging insects such as wasps and bees that are nesting under there, and when I open it up, a lot of them are going to be angry with me for disturbing their home. And so after I've given it a few minutes of observation and I feel confident that there are not stinging insects living under there, I'm going to very gently roll the log or lift the item. I'm going to mostly use my eyes to watch and not my hands, because many of the organisms we're looking at today are very small, and they are using that as habitat. So it's providing shelter and cover, and they do not want to be exposed to predators or to just sunlight and air, open air like this that might dry them out. So use some caution. We're just going to use our powers of observation, and let's go check it out. Okay, and so I have rolled this log. I'm very careful of my feet. I'm also very careful of the animals that live under the log. When I'm done with the activity, I'm going to very gently put this back so that they have shade and shelter and protection and all of the things that they need to survive. So this is just a brief observation that I'm making, and then I'm going to put everything back just exactly the way I found it. All right, let's take a look and see what we found. All right, so let's take a look. We see a couple of different organisms there. So see if you see one moving around a lot with legs. There's 2, 3 of them. And then there's actually one holding very still that has tiger stripes up in the left-hand corner of the picture. All right, and we can see a few more of those, lots of legs, segments. And there is another organism to the left there with those tiger stripes. So this organism has kind of crawled out. It's on a nearby rock in the sun. And if you look closely, you can see it has 8 legs. That's going to help us identify it. And this has an exoskeleton. All right, we are not going to count the legs on this one. You can see it definitely has an exoskeleton, kind of a shiny outer shell. It has lots of legs. It's really showing those legs off right now. Let's look at this up close. So this is an interesting one. This does not really have an exoskeleton, does it? And it's very soft-bodied and pretty wet. Oh, there's a fly there. That's cool. I'm going to show you a couple more examples of this particular organism. And you can see up above here the organism. Oh, it's just starting to move. You see some legs and some antenna there. Okay, there are 2 more of our striped soft-bodied. Oh, you can see an antenna. Let's watch that. And another of our hard-shelled organisms. Oops, just gonna try to hide. You can really see those antenna there and the antenna on the soft-bodied organism. Let's see what else we have. This has lots of segments. It is also soft-bodied, so we can compare and contrast that to the striped ones that have the antenna that we saw. Okay, so now we've got 2 more. The one in the upper right that's pale, lots of segments, lots of legs, has an exoskeleton. Contrast that with the orange one. We don't see the legs. There are some little legs there. But the orange one is actually the larval stage or the juvenile or baby of a beetle. And the pale one is a fully grown adult. They both have important roles to play in this ecosystem. All right, let's begin activity number 1. So we're going to think back to the organisms that we saw, and we are going to compare and contrast them. And this is something that scientists do a lot, and you and I can do as well. And so for this activity, you're just going to need a pencil or a writing utensil and a piece of paper. And so we are going to compare and contrast. So we're going to look at things that are the same, and we're going to look at things that are different. And this helps us classify organisms. And so the first thing is, which organisms were the same and that they had an exoskeleton. It's okay if we don't know their names, we can kind of describe them or we could draw them. And then which organisms did we see that did not have an exoskeleton? So those things that had the really soft bodies and no outer shell covering them for protection. And then once we've gotten a list or a set of drawings here with the organisms that we found, then if we were able to count the legs, and it is okay to use many if we don't know how many exactly there were, but maybe you could compare and contrast, like this organism had fewer and this organism had more. And then again, with the organisms that had no exoskeleton, one way that they might be different is whether or not they had antennae or if they did not. All right, so let's see if we can fill out our chart with the organisms that we found and compare and contrast them. All right, so I filled in my chart just as an example. Yours can look completely different, and that's okay. And I knew the names of most of them, and so I used words, but it is okay to use pictures too. And actually, as a scientist, it's a fantastic observation tool is to do some sketching or drawing of organisms that we see or observe and that we maybe don't know the name of. So things that were the same under exoskeleton, we saw a millipede and a centipede, or several things in that group of organisms. Pillbugs or roly-polies, or woodlice, they have lots of names, and spiders. So those were all things that had a hard outer covering, an exoskeleton, and then I broke it down into how many legs did they have. And so the first thing is, I did not count all those legs because some of those organisms move pretty fast. All right, so millipedes and centipedes had many more legs than I could count, as did the roly-poly. The roly-poly might be a little bit more cooperative. Some of those centipedes and millipedes move pretty fast. So we might actually be able to count the roly-poly legs if they hold still for us. And then the spider has 8 legs. Okay, and then down here where we had no exoskeleton and we had some soft-bodied creatures, we have the slug and the worm. And remember, the slug was really stripy. We saw several of them. And I used antenna as something that was different. So the slugs did have antenna. We couldn't always see them right away, but they eventually would put them out. And the worms did not have antenna. All right, thanks for doing activity 1 with me. All right, So here is activity number 2, and it is graphing the organisms that we found under the log, or that you found at home specifically if you tried this at home. And I got really excited about this project because I really like graphing. I think it's very visual. It's very helps us understand things in a different way. And so I made a couple of different examples, and I bet you can find some other examples as well. And I would love to see them if you create a graph of the organisms either that you saw in the video or that you found at home. I would love to see it. And so remember, it is not important if we can identify them completely or not. We're going to categorize them in whatever way makes sense to us, and then we're going to graph them based on those categorizations. And you can make your graph based on any kind of category that makes sense to you. I'm going to show you a couple of different versions that I made and then invite you to make your own. And so here is one that I made that is more of a pictograph. And what I did for this one, so I have my y-axis is labeled with the number. And I didn't see more than a dozen of anything except ants, and I couldn't count all the ants, so I left them off this graph. That is okay. And then across the bottom on the x-axis, I have things like pill bugs, worms, and I didn't try to tell one species from another. I just called them all worms. Slugs, because I could tell those apart because they were tiger striped and had antennae. And then I categorized millipedes and centipedes, which are all in one family. I counted them together because I didn't know them well enough to separate them out individually. And then you'll see, instead of filling in colors, I actually drew them. So I counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pill bugs. I had 3 worms. I had 2 slugs. And then I had 5 millipedes and centipedes. So this is a great way. You can use this to ask lots of questions. Which organism did I see the most of, the fewest of? Is there a reason for that? Why might the slugs try to get away and get down and get covered up earlier than the pill bugs, who didn't seem to mind being out at all? And it could also lead you to some investigations about what types of habitats different organisms prefer. And so if you have several little places in your backyard or a local park to explore, you might compare and see if this holds true, that you find more pill bugs than anything else when you roll those logs. And remember to always put them back. All right, let's take another look at a different graph that I made in a different style. All right, so here is the second graph, and it's very different. This is a bar graph. And what I did this time was I looked at things that had an exoskeleton, and I had 4 groups of organisms that had an exoskeleton and 2 groups of organisms that did not have an exoskeleton, and I just keyed them out for myself so I could remember. And then things with an exoskeleton, I filled in 4 spaces on my graph and 2 spaces for things without an exoskeleton. And this was a really quick and easy graph. You could definitely get much more involved. You could do individual bars for each organism if you wanted to do pill bugs, the number of pill bugs, the number of millipedes and centipedes, the number of ants, the number of spiders, the number of slugs, the number of worms. And there's some great skills in here when you're graphing, is thinking about the scale that you're going to use, because I don't know about you, but if I looked for ants, I would have hundreds, and everything else is going to be down in the 5 to 6 to 7 range. And so thinking about how I could create a graph that would show that in a meaningful way. It's a great way to develop our math skills and to keep those math skills fresh over the summer. And it's just an interesting way to visualize data, which is a skill that we all need to be able to both create and interpret data sets like this in a visual way. All right, thanks so much for joining me. Thank you so much for joining me here today with part 1 of Life Under a Log. Please join me next Monday at 4 for part 2, and we'll have 2 other activities to do and explore some of these organisms a little bit more. In the meantime, if you're looking for other virtual education opportunities, check out our website at detroitzoo.org. All right, stay safe, take care of each other, and we hope to see you back at the zoo or the BelleIsle Nature Center someday soon.